felt very safe thinking that they would be operating all together in these three provinces. I'm referring also to Canada. And this is how these thoughts actually emerged. Now, of course, the wishes and desires of the militaries of your country and my country and the politicians did not always resemble. So talking about your country, there was definitely a fight. I'm saying fight, it was not a literal fight, of course, between your Foreign Office and the Ministry of Defense, also very much instigated by the fact that Tony Blair at that time articulated often that his preferred partner was the military, was the Ministry of Defense. So they had much power, so to say. When you compare that to my country, it's a bit of a different story. We have an institutionalized group we call it the Steering Group of Military Operations, where various ministries meet and discuss these military operations. But nevertheless, even though the difficulties, the differences between the way decision-making is arranged in your country and decision-making is arranged in my country, this dominant idea came to steer the events. This military initiative was extremely powerful in its shaping ability with regard to the decision-making. Now, when we look at that decision-making, what is also very important to look at is that we often, and this is where we in political science, we often hear about the debate between structure and agency. Now, my research has demonstrated to a great degree the power of agency, the power of these generals, and the shaping ability of this idea. But also what the study has put forward, and I think this is something that a lesson that we definitely should be learning now, reflecting on 20 years of Afghanistan, both in the United Kingdom, but also in my country. The primary focus on the debate why to deploy to Afghanistan didn't consider the why question to a great degree. Everybody seemed to be focused on the how. So discussions on troop numbers, discussions on how much money was going to be provided, the time frame, these were all the most important questions that people were debating upon. But the primary question, the primary political question as to why we should deploy our forces to South Afghanistan was hardly ever answered, especially in my country. You have to know, and this is a major difference between my country and your country. After our fiasco in Srebrenica, we have invented or developed what we call an assessment framework. And this assessment framework, the belief behind it is that it will facilitate rational decision-making and that it will prevent another fiasco like Srebrenica. However, what happened is that this assessment framework did not only have the workings of a trap, but also ever since the appearance of this assessment framework, our parliament has informally, but actually formally it has no formal power to decide whether we deploy forces. But because of the grand fear that another debacle like that will happen again, Parliament acquired itself with informal power that became more or less formal. Now, why is this important to know? Because the primary function of Parliament then is to debate and question the use of force, to debate and question whether we are to deploy our forces to whatever region. Now, when you investigate the decision-making in my country, the primary debates were on the how, first of all, and secondly, it was primarily national and party politics that came to steer the debate in Parliament. Now, going back to your country, what was very prominent in your country is what we refer to in political science and foreign policy analysis, groupthink, the way your prime minister came to steer the course of events in terms of that this was inevitable, your country needed to go and needed to acquire itself a prominent role in the stabilization of South Afghanistan is something that was very important when we talk to the reconstruction of the decision making in your country. Now, with regard to the strategy that was devised in both your country and my country, another striking similarity appeared, is that both the UK and the Netherlands have always said until today that they believe in an integrated approach, we call whole of government 3D approach. But what happened in both countries is that not a joint strategy was actually adopted at the strategic political level. What happened is that what I would refer to an emergent strategy from the bottom up emerged in both your country and my country. And when we focus into the United Kingdom, you would see a general messenger and Mark Etherington, who actually served together and then ended up in Kandahar trying to put together this joint plan, truly wanting to articulate the necessity of operating together in terms of, DFID, your Foreign Office and the Ministry of Defense. But once it was sent back to your capital, the willingness to actually adopt that particular plan and to sign it off as the national or as the strategy of the United Kingdom never really happened. The same happened to my country. So even though governments said that we needed to stabilize South Afghanistan, Uruzgan, in a joint manner, and we needed to have an integrated approach, the 3D approach. Also in my country, what happened was that you had a military commander who was really keen, I must say, into setting up a joint campaign plan. But at the same time, we had our Foreign Office who was composing a civil assessment at the embassy in Kabul. And the whole idea behind it was that in The Hague, these two plans were put back together and then, it would be a joint plan and then our government would sign off. Now, what is interesting about these findings is not only that the integrated approach, which is often advocated as the way to go, was not adopted in practice, but what is also interesting to see is that both capitals really had no interest in signing off on these plans. In other words, to take political accountability when it comes to these strategies. Now, what does that tell us? I think many of the findings of my study actually illustrate that the normative underpinnings of dominant theories on civil-military relations, dominant theories on strategy, but also dominant theories on how we should best stabilize failed states or unstable states are to be questioned. And I think that this is something I would really like to call for. Also, again, looking back to 20 years of Afghanistan. I am not claiming that there should be no civilian control of the military as if male theory says. I am just advocating very much in line actually with Professor Hugh Strachan, is that we should look into the quality of the dialogue between the civil military elites, because when this dialogue won't improve the way we are going to articulate strategy is going to be problematic. But when we talk about strategy, I think we should be a little bit more flexible and maybe embrace the notion of an emergent strategy from the bottom up. But we do then at the end have to accept political accountability for that particular strategy. And then last but not least, the realization that we have really believed over so many years that we are able to change societies into societies like we would like to see them, is a lesson that has been identified more than 30 years ago by many people, among those Michael D. Schaefer, whom I mentioned in the beginning. And I think it's extremely important that we are going to investigate that. How is it possible that there are so many studies that tell us that whenever we fail in our stabilization efforts, we have a tendency to look into the implementation of those efforts instead of questioning the whole design of those efforts, the basic questions that we are asking ourselves. Or to close off with the words of Michael D. Shaver, are we able and willing to investigate and criticize our assumptions as Western societies when it comes to the stabilization of countries like Afghanistan? This is actually these are the main claims of my book. I'm not sure if I already took too much time. I can talk about the book for a very long time, but I know that Nick would like to share some thoughts from Afghanistan, from his own field experience as well. And I'm very much looking forward to the Q&A afterwards.
Miriam, thank you very much. That's a very extremely clear and hard-hitting account of the studies that you've made of this, and very much appreciated, I know, by the Rusi family, that we always pride ourselves at Rusi that we tell it like it is, without fear or favor. And that's why we are an independent organization, an independent think tank that works closely with the MOD and government, but it's not part of the MOD and the government. So let me hand over now to Nick Reynolds. Nick is a research analyst in the land warfare in the military sciences group. He's served in the army in Afghanistan himself, but his primary interests at RUSI are in land power. And interestingly, he takes an interest in wargaming and simulation. And in these days of virtual realities and new ways of thinking about military power, I think that's a pretty good line to be pursuing. So Nick, over to you.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks, Miriam. So I'm here to provide a British perspective, particularly on the downstream impacts of the dynamics that Miriam's research highlighted. So during the British campaign in Afghanistan, there were serious discontinuities evident, even much later on in the Helmand campaign, between the civil and military efforts. Due to intelligence failures regarding how difficult Helmand would prove, the rhetoric of providing security and supporting development never matched activity. That activity was of a medium intensity combat sustained over months and years. Furthermore, uncomfortable issues such as the institutional weakness of Afghan government partners and the local tribal politics that existed in parallel to the officially understood government versus Taliban dynamic that the military put forward as its reason for being there were underrepresented in the planning and execution of operations. I think in particular, the issues that Miriam raised regarding how the missions in Helmand and Uruzgan were driven by the military and planned without sufficient thoughts regarding why operations should be conducted in the first place was still playing out at the operational and tactical levels several years into the campaigns. So part of this was beyond the military's control. I think in the absence of other agencies getting involved in the planning or working at a scale or at a level of capacity equal to the military mission, the military, as the largest institution present, were inherently going to be the ones who drove strategy. But without appropriate metrics for success and well-conceived, achievable objectives set from the top, both difficult when the why question had not been fully addressed early on, certain activities came to dominate operations. I think in particular, force protection, countering the ID network, and significant ground clearing operations every 6 months as a kind of signature operation to demonstrate progress. These came to be a very, very dominant operational dynamics. I will caveat that the first two in particular were pressing considerations and are perhaps more an example of Taliban success than British misapplication of resources. Through determined insurgent activity to constrain the British ability to conduct operations, the Taliban essentially need to be countered by a dedicated lines of effort. However, these should have the counter ID and force protection. These should have been enabling activities and objectives for other activities, particularly non-military ones. Instead, they became the ends in themselves. Many other activities that should have happened did not, or were under-resourced and treated as secondary considerations. In particular, the issues with ISAF's Afghan partner institutions were inadequately addressed. And likewise, capacity building activity never resulted in the hope for ability of these institutions to sustain themselves. So to anyone who has followed Afghanistan over the years, I mean, this is a very familiar story. But the results were, I really want to highlight, were a direct consequence of initial planning failures. So with that, I'd like to hand back to Mike.
Yeah, Nick, thank you very much. That's very interesting. What we're looking at here is that, too many tactics and not enough strategy. And we concentrated on the tactics all the time, as if somehow, if you got the tactics right, the strategy would emerge. I think I don't disagree with anything that either of you have said. I feel as chairman, I should just, as it were, put in another consideration, at least to, as it would, defend government in this respect. I mean, one sense is that, when the Canadian, the Dutch and the British military, as it were, hatched the idea of the three provinces, I mean, in a sense, saving the American plan from its own failings in Afghanistan, in a way, there's nothing so improper about that if they then hand a series of strategic options up to politicians. The issue, I think, as Hugh Strawn makes clear, is that, well, maybe the politicians don't ask the right questions and maybe the dialogue isn't good enough. But, the idea that the strategy is worked out as a possibility by senior officers is not so terrible. It's what happens to it after that. And the other thing I would say, although we're very critical about the way in which Western powers behaved after 2001, there's a real hinge point because of the 9/11 attacks and the different attitudes after that. But remember that in the 90s and all the operations that Miriam, that you were involved in, I mean, Srebrenica, Banja Luka, they were standout moments. But in general, there was a lot of good peace support operations in the 90s, and the Western powers generally had a sense, well, we know how to do this, we're good at it, it's messy, but we do it. And the issue was, could it be applied to much bigger cases? These were small cases in Bosnia and Croatia and then even Kosovo. It was trying to scale the thing up. But I get more sympathetic to politicians if I try and put myself back into the 2001, 2002 mentalities. That's all. So I just wanted to raise those perspectives. We've got some questions. Let's